She saw the poison go into his food, but no one believed her. Would she make it in time to save his life? Cheeks. Let me go. You don't understand, there's an evil woman in there, she put poison in the food, Dorothy shouted, her voice echoing through the restaurant's entrance. Inside the restaurant, through the glass doors, Dorothy could see the waiter emerging from the kitchen with the fatal dish in his hands. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized she was failing in her desperate mission to save a life. No, 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 please, someone has to hear me. I think the woman is trying to poison James Cater, he's going to die if he eats that food, she shouted louder, her desperation growing by the second. The guard dragged her away from the entrance while other staff members approached to see what was happening. Dorothy kept struggling, desperately trying to make someone understand the gravity of the situation. Why doesn't he believe me? Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I'm lying, she thought in anguish. In the midst of the commotion, Sonia elegantly emerged through the front door, probably hearing the girls' screams from outside. The elegant woman cast a disdainful look at the unfolding scene, her eyes met Dorothy's for a brief moment, and the girl could see a glint of threat in that seemingly serene gaze. You won't get away with this, you evil witch, Dorothy shouted as she was taken away. The waiter had already disappeared into the main dining room with the poisoned dish, and Dorothy felt her hopes fade away. Her legs finally gave out, and she fell to her knees on the cold sidewalk, freeing herself from the guard and sobbing in frustration and helplessness. What do I do now? How can I save someone when no one wants to let me in? She whispered to herself, feeling completely defeated. Through her tears, Dorothy saw Sonia enter her luxurious car, a satisfied smile playing on her red lips. The girl felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was alone with this terrible secret. It won't stay like this. I promise I'll find a way to prove the truth, even if it's the last thing I do, she vowed to herself, determination replacing despair in her voice. The sound of breaking plates inside the restaurant made Dorothy quickly lift her head. Her heart raced again, wondering if the poisoned dish had reached its destination. The agony of uncertainty consumed her from within. Please, may something have happened to prevent this tragedy, she murmured, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Dorothy watched the movement at the restaurant entrance desperately, her hands trembling as she tried to think of a way to get in. The security guard who had expelled her returned to his post but seemed distracted by his cell phone. The girl noticed that he occasionally looked inside the restaurant where soft music played and people chatted animatedly, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. I need to find a way to get in. I can't let that man die because of that evil woman, she whispered to herself, studying every move of the security guard. A group of elegant customers approached the entrance, catching the guard's attention as he hurried to open the door for them. Dorothy saw her opportunity. While the man greeted the newcomers, she could try to sneak behind them. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. It's now or never, please God help me save that man, she muttered, adjusting her tattered cap and preparing to run. The guard turned to attend another customer arriving in a shiny black Mercedes, and Dorothy seized the crucial moment. Her eyes, accustomed to seeking gaps in the streets to survive, quickly identified the safest path. With the agility that only a street child possesses, developed after years of escaping danger, she swiftly slid through the entrance. Her bare feet made no noise against the polished marble. Keeping low, she hid behind a sumptuous arrangement of white orchids in the lobby. Her heart beating so hard she feared someone might hear it. Where is he? I need to find him before it's too late. Please God help me save him, she thought frantically, her wide eyes scanning the room as her hands trembled uncontrollably. The luxurious environment made her feel even smaller and more insignificant with its immense crystal chandeliers shedding golden light on elegant tapestry and expensive artworks. The contrast between her reflection in the gilded mirror on the wall, a dirty girl in tattered clothes, and the opulence of the place made her stomach churn. Dorothy could hear the tinkling of crystal glasses and the soft sound of silver cutlery against fine porcelain, mixed with polite conversations and contained laughter. Little do they know that a murder is about to take place right under their noses. I hope I can make it in time, she whispered to herself, feeling a mixture of anger and despair. A tall, slender man with a perfectly trimmed mustache rushed past her carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than she would ever see in her life. Dorothy took advantage of his elongated shadow to move stealthily between the tables like a small shadow herself. Her bare dirty feet left small marks on the Persian red carpet, but she didn't care about the evidence she was leaving behind. Time was running out, and every second lost could mean the difference between life and death. I can't fail now, not after coming this far, she muttered, her eyes frantically scanning the room for James. That's when she saw him. James Cater was sitting at a table in the center of the room, as if he were the main star of a tragic play about to unfold. His imposing figure in a bespoke navy blue suit contrasted with the snow-white tablecloth. He was examining the dish that had just been served, steam rising in sinister spirals from the poisoned food. A smile of approval was beginning to form on his lips as he appreciated the presentation of the dish. No, please don't touch that food, Dorothy thought desperately. If only I could shout without that security guard stopping me from reaching him, her mind screamed as she calculated the distance she would need to cover. James raised the silver fork, and time seemed to slow down for Dorothy, as if the universe were prolonging that crucial moment. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the polished metal of the utensil, creating little dancing rainbows on the walls. She saw, as if in slow motion, the fork approaching the poisoned food. Her body reacted on pure instinct, driven by a force she didn't know she possessed. She ran from her hiding place like a wild animal, knocking over a tray of champagne, pushing chairs, and bumping into stunned waiters in the process. "Don't eat that. Your wife put poison in it," she shouted with all the strength of her lungs, her hoarse voice echoing through the now tomb-silent room. But it was too late. By the time Dorothy reached the table shouting, James had already taken the first forkful to his mouth. His dark brown eyes met hers, a mixture of surprise and confusion on his well-groomed face. The fork fell from his trembling hand, clinking against the fine porcelain and breaking the momentary silence that had settled. "Who are you? What's going on?" he managed to stutter, his voice already starting to fail. James's face, once rosy and healthy, began to pale at an alarming rate. Large beads of sweat broke out on his forehead, trickling down his temples and staining the collar of his white dress shirt. His hands, now violently trembling, knocked over the glass of red wine that was nearby, the dark liquid spilling over the white tablecloth. "My God, someone help!" His feeling unwell, shouted an elderly lady at the next table. James tried to get up, leaning heavily on the table, but his legs seemed made of jelly. His eyes began to roll back in their sockets, showing only the whites, and his breathing became a distressing wheeze. Dorothy, driven by a protective instinct, ran to support him, but her small body could barely bear the man's weight. "He needs help. Please, someone do something," Dorothy pleaded, her tears now mingling with sweat. Chaos had completely taken over the luxurious restaurant. A woman screamed hysterically when James began to writhe, his body seized by violent spasms. Plates fell and shattered as people backed away in panic, children's cries mingling with the screams and exclamations of horror from the other patrons. It was his wife. Sonia put poison in the food. I saw everything through the kitchen window. "Help me save him," Dorothy shouted amid the tumult. James's body began to convulse violently against the marble floor where he had collapsed seconds earlier. His limbs thrashed with such force that no one could approach him. Dorothy, desperate, tried to protect his head from hitting the ground. "Don't die. Please don't die. I tried to warn you, I swear I tried," the girl sobbed. James's face was turning increasingly purplish as his body twisted violently on the floor. A young waiter ran over with a glass of water, his hand shaking so much that half the liquid spilled before reaching them. "Water. We have to make him drink water," the desperate waiter shouted, trying to approach the convulsing man. "No. Don't give him water, he could drown," Dorothy yelled, pushing the glass away with a strength she didn't know she had. "We need to turn him on his side, he needs to breathe." Two other waiters tried to approach with wet napkins but backed away in fright when James had a particularly violent spasm, knocking over another nearby table. The sound of shattering plates echoed through the room, mingling with the screams of terror from the patrons. "Hold that criminal here until the police arrive," the maitre d' ordered, his usually composed face now contorted with rage and fear. Dorothy watched, powerless and desperate, as James's body continued to thrash on the marble floor. Her small hands, now trapped by the enormous hands of the security guard, could no longer help. Fat tears streamed down her dirty face as she saw the man she had tried to save fighting for his life. "Please believe me. The guilty one will get away." It was Sonia. She planned all of this. Her voice, already hoarse from shouting, could barely be heard amid the chaos. The sound of sirens began to approach as James finally stopped thrashing, his body lying frighteningly still on the floor. The ensuing silence was more deafening than all the previous screams. Dorothy felt her own body go limp in the security guard's arms, the adrenaline being replaced by a crushing fatigue. "Why does no one ever believe a street kid?" she whispered to herself as the red and blue lights began to illuminate the restaurant windows. Dorothy felt an inexplicable strength take over her small body. With a sudden movement, she managed to break free from the guard holding her and ran toward James, who was still lying on the floor. Her years on the streets had taught her that in emergency situations, acting quickly was the difference between life and death. "Listen to me. I have an idea. I think I can help." "I've seen this happen before," Dorothy shouted, her voice carrying an authority surprising for someone so young. With quick, precise movements learned from homeless people who often suffered seizures, she began to loosen James's tie and collar. Her small hands, so dirty, moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "He needs to breathe. Move away anything that could hurt him," she ordered, removing nearby objects that could injure him during the convulsions. The restaurant customers formed a circle around them, some still filming with their cell phones, others shouting accusations. The maitre d' tried to pull Dorothy away again, but she remained steadfast, protecting James with her own body. "If you're not going to help, at least don't get in the way. He's dying, and all you know how to do is film," shouted the girl, her words making some lower their phones in shame. James began to have more violent spasms, his face turning even more purple. Dorothy knew she needed to act quickly. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to turn him on his side again, preventing him from choking. The marble floor was cold against her bare knees, but she felt no discomfort, focused solely on her mission. "Hold on, Mr. James. I won't let your wife's evil prevail," she whispered in his ear while keeping his head protected. One of the security guards tried again to drag Dorothy away, but this time several customers intervened. "Let the girl help. She seems to know what she's doing," shouted an elderly lady, her voice trembling with emotion. The guard hesitated, his face a mask of confusion. "If he dies because you prevented me from helping, you'll all be guilty," declared Dorothy, her voice laden with a maturity beyond her years. The following minutes were chaotic. While Dorothy tried to help James, the restaurant staff argued among themselves about whether or not to call an ambulance and the police. The prejudice against the street girl was costing precious time. The convulsions began to subside, but James was still breathing with great difficulty. "Please, someone call an ambulance. He was poisoned, he needs medical help," Dorothy implored, but the people seemed paralyzed. "Time is precious. I have no way to call an ambulance, I don't have a phone. I need to act quickly and do something right away. This gentleman needs a doctor," she thought, realizing that no one would take action. Dorothy did the only thing she could. She decided to take James to the hospital herself. Her thin legs trembled with the effort as she tried to lift the man. To her surprise, James began to partially regain consciousness. Who are you?" he mumbled, his voice almost inaudible, his eyes still unfocused. With steely determination, Dorothy put James's arm around her shoulders. I'm the person trying to save your life, sir. My name is Dorothy. Can you stand? We need to go to the hospital, she spoke firmly, ignoring the protests of the restaurant staff. Don't let this girl take Mr. James. She must be involved in all of this. Don't trust her, shouted the maitre d', but his voice already sounded distant. James, still dazed and confused, managed to stand with Dorothy's help. His large body leaned heavily on the small girl, but she didn't complain. Each step was a battle, but she knew she couldn't give up. Trust me, Mr. James. I know it's hard, but I'm the only person here who really wants to help you, she whispered, guiding him slowly towards the exit. The path to the door seemed endless. People tried to stop them, some employees threatened to call the police, but Dorothy kept going, her determination greater than any obstacle. James stumbled with every step but managed to stay conscious. Hospital, we need to go, he muttered, beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. At the restaurant exit, the security guard made one last attempt to stop them, positioning himself in front of the door. Dorothy looked at him with a mixture of anger and pleading. If you have a shred of humanity, you'll let us pass. He needs doctors, not accusations. Let them go, said the same elderly lady from before, her voice now firm and authoritative. The cold night air hit their faces when they finally managed to get out. Dorothy knew that the nearest hospital was a few blocks away. Each step was torture for James, who still had occasional spasms. Just a little further, Mr. James. The hospital isn't far, and there they'll believe me when I tell them about your wife, Dorothy spoke, both to encourage him and to keep him conscious. The streets were relatively empty at that hour, but the few pedestrians who passed looked frightened at the strange pair, a dirty street girl guiding a well-dressed man who could barely walk. Some offered help, but Dorothy refused, fearing they might prevent her from telling the truth to the authorities. I can't trust anyone now. I need to make sure he gets to the hospital alive and that everyone knows it was Sonia, she thought as she continued her journey. James was getting worse with every block, his face alternating between deathly pale and purple hues, and his breathing was becoming more and more difficult. Dorothy could feel his heart beating irregularly through his expensive suit. Hang in there. I can already see the hospital lights. You're strong, you'll make it, she encouraged, even feeling her own muscles screaming with exhaustion. With each step they took, Dorothy could hear sirens in the distance, probably from the police who'd been called to the restaurant. She knew she had to reach the hospital before they found her, or they would never believe her story. They won't believe me. My word as a street girl has no power. I'll hardly be able to prove what I saw, but this time a street child will bring justice, she promised herself, quickening her pace as much as James could keep up. The city lights were beginning to turn on, casting long shadows on the sidewalks. James's weight seemed to increase with every moment, and Dorothy could feel her own strength fading, but the memory of Sonia's cruel smile kept her moving. Just 2 more blocks, Mr. James. When we get there, you'll get help, and everything will be all right. You'll be safe, and all this will be over, she murmured, more to herself than to him. James tried to say something but could only emit a groan of pain. His eyes, though half closed, remained fixed on Dorothy, as if trying to understand how that little street girl was risking everything to save him. Don't try to speak now, save your strength. We'll be safe soon, she said. Adjusting his arm better over her shoulders. A group of drunken youths blocked the sidewalk ahead, laughing loudly and occupying the entire space. Dorothy knew she couldn't risk passing through them. James could barely stay on his feet, let alone dodge drunken people. We have to take another route, Mr. James. I know a shortcut, but it's down a darker street, she whispered, guiding him into a side alley. The alley was partially flooded due to recent rain, and the stench of garbage was suffocating. Dorothy's bare feet sank into the dirty water, but she couldn't afford to choose another route due to the time it would take. James stumbled over a broken bottle, nearly bringing them both down. "Watch your step. Hold on to me. I can't let you fall now," she said firmly, her small body tensing to support more weight. A stray dog began barking furiously at them, advancing with bared teeth. Dorothy knew this type of situation well. On the streets, vicious dogs were a constant danger. With one hand, she gestured for the dog to back off, keeping James balanced with the other. "Go away. We don't have time for this," she yelled at the animal, her voice echoing off the alley walls. Emerging from the alley, they were met with a construction site blocking the street Dorothy intended to use. Her heart sank. They would now have to take a much longer detour. James groaned in pain, his legs faltering again. "I can't let you give up. I'll find another way. Trust me," she pleaded, watching the beads of cold sweat trickling down the businessman's face. The sound of police sirens began echoing through the streets, and Dorothy could see the lights reflecting off the windows of buildings. They needed to hide, but James could barely move. She spotted a small convenience store and, on impulse, pulled him inside. "Please, just a few minutes until the police pass. We can't let them find us before the hospital," she murmured, helping James lean against the counter. The store owner looked alarmed at the odd pair, a dirty girl and a well-dressed, clearly ill man. He opened his mouth to protest, but Dorothy cut him off. "He's sick. We just need to wait a few minutes, please," Dorothy said, but the man ignored her. "Get out of here before I call the police. I don't want any trouble in my store," he responded, already reaching for the phone. Forced outside, they found the street now crowded with people leaving work. Each jostle made James groan in pain, and Dorothy had to struggle to keep him upright. A woman stopped to help but, upon seeing his condition, began asking too many questions. "We don't have time for explanations. He needs to get to the hospital now," Dorothy cut her off, pulling James away from the well-meaning woman. A police car slowly drove past them, and Dorothy felt her heart stop. She quickly guided James behind a newspaper stand, praying they wouldn't be seen and she wouldn't be arrested for something she didn't do. The newspaper vendor eyed them suspiciously, but something in Dorothy's determined eyes made him remain silent. "If they find us now, they'll arrest me, and he'll die. I can't let that happen," she thought, holding her breath until the patrol car passed. James did his best to help, even in his near catatonic state. He walked with difficulty, leaning on the girl as little as possible while she bravely assisted him. He tried to say something, likely an attempt at gratitude, but only managed an inaudible sound. "You don't need to try thanking me. I would do this for anyone who needed help. I learned on the streets that we should help everyone, maybe because I myself need the help of kind people I meet along the way," she said, as much to distract him as herself. The lights of the hospital were already visible in the distance, like a beacon of hope in the dark night. Dorothy could feel James reaching his limit, his body growing heavier against hers, almost collapsing with each step. Through the glass doors, she could see the chaos inside the emergency room, gurneys lining the hallways, people moaning in pain, and staff rushing back and forth. "Please let someone be able to help us, he can't wait much longer," she whispered to herself, feeling James grow heavier with each step. As they entered the lobby, they were met with a stifling, tense environment. The emergency room was packed. The security guard, a tall, burly man, immediately started walking toward them, his expression hardening as he took in Dorothy's bedraggled state. "This is no place for beggars. Go beg for change somewhere else," he bellowed, completely ignoring James's dire condition. James chose that moment to have another violent spasm, nearly bringing them both crashing to the floor. His face had now taken on an alarming purple hue. Dorothy struggled to keep him upright, her legs trembling with the effort. "Can't you see he's dying? It's an emergency, he was poisoned," Dorothy yelled, her voice echoing through the chaotic lobby. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with deep dark circles under her eyes, didn't even lift her eyes from her computer screen. Take a number and wait. All the doctors are busy with a multiple emergency from a highway accident, she said. Can't you see he's dying? This is an emergency. He was poisoned, Dorothy insisted, desperate. A second security guard approached, increasing the tension in the air. James began having more violent seizures, his heavy body slipping from Dorothy's frail arms. The girl tried desperately to keep him upright, her legs trembling under the weight. He's bleeding. Oh my God, he's bleeding. Panic was evident in the girl's voice as she tried to wipe the blood with her tattered sleeve. At that moment, an older nurse emerged from one of the corridors, carrying a stack of medical records. Her experienced eyes took in the scene, lingering first on James and then on Dorothy. Her expression changed instantly. Blessed Virgin, this is James Cater, the businessman, she exclaimed, dropping the medical records to the floor with a thud. The older nurse's eyes widened in recognition of James, her medical records forgotten on the floor. My God, it's James Cater. Call the doctor immediately, she shouted, running to examine the patient but keeping a suspicious look towards Dorothy. Don't let that girl leave, she must have something to do with his condition, she ordered the security guards, who tightened their grip on the child's arms even more. James began having an even more violent seizure, his entire body shaking against the hospital's cold floor. The nurse shouted orders as other staff rushed in with equipment. Dorothy tried to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the commotion. He was poisoned. I tried to help him, he got a little better, but he's getting worse again, Dorothy explained, but most of the staff ignored her completely. A heart monitor was rushed in, and the sound of James's irregular heartbeats filled the air. Dorothy watched helplessly as the nurses worked, connecting electrodes and checking his vital signs. No one even looked in her direction. The heartbeats are getting weaker. Where's the doctor? One of the nurses shouted, her hands moving quickly over James's body. The businessman began exhibiting more alarming symptoms. His skin took on a bluish hue, and his breathing became shallower by the minute. The security guards kept holding Dorothy, who struggled desperately. He's going to die if you don't act fast. The poison was dark, I saw her put it in, her words were lost in the chaos of the emergency room. Finally, the doctor arrived, running down the hallway. Upon seeing James, he immediately began shouting orders. Emergency room 3 now. This case looks like poisoning, call the police, we need to know what happened to him, the doctor said, assessing the patient. The police have already been called, doctor. This girl was with him, she probably has something to do with it, one of the security guards replied. Dorothy felt her heart sink when she heard sirens approaching. She knew no one would believe her story, that her word was worthless. She was a beggar, they would never believe Sonia James could be capable of such wickedness against her husband, especially with the power she had. James was being rushed down the hallway, and Dorothy could do nothing. If he dies, it's your fault for not listening to me, she shouted, tears of anger and frustration streaming down her dirty face. The sound of the machines grew more frantic, and Dorothy could hear the doctor's alarmed voices as they took James away. Another violent seizure shook his body on the gurney, and the doctors ran alongside him. Blood pressure plummeting. We need immediate treatment, the doctor's voice echoed down the hallway. The doors of the emergency room opened again, and several police officers entered. Dorothy panicked, feeling her heart racing in her chest.